Hi, welcome, hopefully back to this series of interviews, conversations with media scholars that I'm just a huge fan of, and today I'm talking with a very dear old friend, Herman Wasserman. We both share a history of being a journalist in South Africa. Of course, he being from South Africa and me visiting and living in South Africa for a while in the 1990s. And Herman is currently a professor of media studies at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And before, he's held positions at the University of Stellenbosch and at Rhodes University in South Africa, but also at Newcastle University and Sheffield University in the United Kingdom. He's written many books and articles, most recently Media, Geopolitics and Power, A View from the Global South, for which he has won several awards, including one at the ICA, the International Communication Association. His new book that we're going to be talking a lot about today is called The Ethics of Engagement, Media, Conflict and Democracy in Africa with Oxford University Press. He's published widely on media, ethics and democracy, consulted for organizations such as the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and the Center for International Media Assistance. He's been a visiting scholar all over the world at Indiana University. Around the time when I worked there, another way our paths have crossed over the last 20 years or so, 25 years or so. At Tsinghua University in China, at the Ludwig Maximilian University. He's won various prestigious awards and prizes, including the NEVA Prize for Journalism Theory, the George Foster Prize from the German Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and of course the Fulbright Fellowship. He's the editor-in-chief of the journal African Journalism Studies and editor of the Annals of the International Communication Association at the ICA, where he's also a fellow and an elected member of the Academy of Science of South Africa. And look, with Herman, we're going to talk about what ties his work together, this notion of listening across differences, the ethics of listening as a key concept that runs across all his work. How do we truly do justice to a diverse world where conflict is an inevitable byproduct of human life, of the health of human society? What role and responsibility do the media have in such a context, and specifically journalism and the work of journalists? Herman is, as always, optimistic yet critical. He gives us perspective from afar, but engages in the everyday practice as a mediator, as an educator, as somebody who truly takes the position and voices of people, of the lived experience of people on the ground seriously. And that's one of many reasons why I'm so excited about our interview today. Enjoy. Right, it's good. Welkom. Hello.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for being here, Herman. You are in front of the lovely Cape Mountains, which you both are and you're not, right? Because you are, actually, of course, in Cape Town, also at the University of Cape Town, but we're looking at a beautiful background. It's summer over there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's summer and it's beautiful weather, and I'm not too far physically from that picture. I actually hiked up that very mountain this weekend, so I'm in my home office, but it's close to where. But that's the university, and that's the backdrop to the university. So it's a beautiful campus as well. So
stunning. Well, thanks so much for making the time. I know you just came out of summer holidays over where I am. Today is the first day that the snow is beginning to retreat, so it's
Okay.
an interesting time weather-wise. Um, I would love to chat about a whole bunch of things. I mean, you've got a new book coming out that is, of course, something we will definitely want to talk about. But to begin, I want to talk a little bit about something about our shared history, which is that of being a journalist, and not just being a journalist, but being a journalist in the mid 1990s in South Africa. Uh, um, um, uh, I worked for the Beeld newspaper, Afrikaans language newspaper in Johannesburg in 1995. And I think around the same time you joined the Burger in Cape Town. And of course, you were a reporter. I was just a column writer, massive difference. But we both worked for these newspapers that were trying to find a new role, a new identity in this new South Africa. Formerly, these newspapers were very much aligned with the National Party, which of course was the party of apartheid. But then in the 90s, they sort of had to reinvent themselves and did so more or less successfully. And we were kind of part of that shift. And I was just wondering, and during that time, during your work for the Burger, you were also doing your PhD. So maybe you can take me back a little bit to that time we've shared of working in a country going through that massive transition. I mean, we started in 1995. Nelson Mandela just became president. It was the first local elections post-apartheid in 1995, if I remember correctly. South Africa became World Cup rugby champions. I mean, it was they won the Africa Cup of Nations, right? The soccer cup. I mean, there was so much going on. I remember that it was both like crazy exhilarating and also just incredibly sometimes painful to that was my experience of that time. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like at that time and how this sort of shaped or perhaps inspired your own work, especially your research as an academic?
Yeah, thanks. I think, it was a tremendously interesting time, just to be alive, to use the cliche. I mean, it was a profoundly interesting time to be a young reporter in South Africa as well. I did my journalism postgrad degree in 1994, which was the year of the democratic elections. And so, as training to become a journalist in those exciting times, and then starting at the Burger in 1995. And as you say, it was a very interesting time, not only in the country, it was exhilarating, but it was also interesting to work as a journalist. So on the one hand, the country was being reborn, and it was, it sounds again like a cliche, but history was being made around us. It was partly this sort of Janus figure of looking back. We had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where all these things became unearthed of the past, which was tremendously traumatic. At the one side, people trying to take stock of just exactly what happened. And especially as a white person as well in the country, you were maybe isolated and sheltered and ignorant of a lot of things. And all of that came up, and you had to engage with it and deal with it. And also in a way with your own past, but a past that you maybe weren't as aware of. But at the same time, this future was beckoning. We had I was a general reporter for a while, and then went onto the arts desk, and being a sort of writing about music, and having all these bands coming to the country just because they wanted to see the place and see the place change. It was fantastic in a way. But it was also interesting, I think, for other reasons you point out, professionally, because we had the opportunity to sort of auto-ethnographically document or experience the way that a media organization and the media in general had to reposition itself and transform itself to meet the demands of this new country. So the Afrikaans media, as you point out, they had a history of supporting in various degrees. There were also anti-apartheid Afrikaans media, which we should also be sure to point out, like Vrye Weekblad, and more radical, even underground newspapers like Saamstaan and so on. But the mainstream media, by and large, supported either tacitly or explicitly apartheid. And by the time that we joined, it was formally a democracy, and they they had to reposition themselves, and not only their value system and their normative frameworks, but also transform their newsrooms and think about how to engage with this new government. So witnessing all of that, I think, was tremendously instructive, how a newsroom also had to reinvent itself and reposition itself. And so I think, I wrote about this specifically, a little bit about the Afrikaans media specifically, how they repositioned themselves. But I also think this provided the groundwork for my subsequent engagement with larger topics such as media and new democracies, media and conflict, and especially, I think, media and normative theory, to think about how does a country's media reposition itself and think about its normative framework, its regulatory systems, and all of that. And we witnessed that firsthand. So I think it did provide a sort of backdrop for all my subsequent work in the subsequent decades.
Yeah, I mean, one of my many fond memories of living and working in South Africa in the 90s was also coming to terms with well, if anything, the fact that the new South Africa had 11 official national languages at the time, right? I mean, it still does, of course. I mean, it's the amount of diversity in that one single country, from climate zones to languages to, political issues and discussion, is just astounding. And me being white and Dutch and thinking that I can do Afrikaans, and then of course I couldn't, and playing in the football team of the University of Pretoria, and then realizing I was the only white guy except from the goalkeeper, and just all these. It is key, I guess, to all those experiences, how to develop a way of communicating with each other, right? I mean, and it seems that is also like a very dominant frame in your work right from the get-go. I mean, your earliest work was about intercultural dialogue, and in part with reference to Afrikaans culture and the Afrikaans language, but more in general. So that notion of dialogue, of finding ways to communicate and to trace that back in literature, in how people act online, seems really key in your work. Is that something that is very particular to you, or do you think that is sort of a thread running, that perhaps it is a South African thing, that this preoccupation with dialogue, with communication, with to bridging all those incredibly complicated divides in that country?
Yes, I think it is an ongoing preoccupation. I think issues of identity, belonging, diversity, conflict, these are leitmotifs, I think, throughout South African literature, media studies, and so on. I think the diversity that you mentioned is partly a challenge, of course, and we saw that when newsrooms had to transform, and that process is not yet complete. I mean, I think that is still an imperative, but we have come a long way since the 90s. So that pressure, that imperative to transform, to become more diverse, to listen to others, those, I think, are quite common themes and threads in academic and in the humanities, certainly in South Africa. But it's also, I think, a very strong benefit. I think if you and I mean, it's not only South Africa but also the continent. If you think about and South Africa tend to be maybe very inward looking and parochial sometimes, and we, because of this interesting history and this interesting political context, we also have this very navel gazing sometimes, think about ourselves, and also the history of exceptionalism and isolation from the rest of the continent. So I mean, I've really tried hard to travel more on the continent and see other African countries and engage with African colleagues as well. So there's a lot to learn just from our place in a very diverse continent as well. But it's a tremendous opportunity and a privilege, really, to work in this context, because if we now think about the academic imperatives of de-Westernizing and decolonizing, internationalizing, these terms that have become, I think, in the last few years, really to the forefront, also even in a place like the US, and Europe, dealing with these the diversity issues. I think, we can say, well, we have dealt with this and we are still dealing with this, but we have maybe lessons that we can share with the rest of the world in a very humble and sort of modest way, of course, and recognizing that you can't transplant things from one context to another. But I think if we talk about decolonizing, and internationalizing, it's sometimes seen as a burden or something that people have to do. But actually there's so much to learn in such a diverse context, and it's such a privilege to be able to respond to that diversity or try to find your place within it. So yeah, maybe that's a long answer to your question, but I think that recognition of diversity and the recognition that you have to relativize your own position and that your own views are always limited and that it is always provisional. I think those are really good skills to have if you're an academic, and I think we acquire them maybe also through osmosis in a way in this country.
Is that part of what inspired you? Because I mean, if you look at your career, I mean, of course, as academics, one of the most wonderful privileges of our job is that we get to travel, right? That we get to go to, especially if we work at universities that provide funding, that we can go to international conferences and that we can meet colleagues from other cultures, other countries, and exchange points of view and build friendships. And that's absolutely lovely, and one thing that is so sorely missing, of course, from our current Corona context. But I mean, in your career, you've always taken that a step further. I mean, you've often opted for extended research stays, sabbaticals, fellowships, and I mean, in Europe, in the US, in China. Like you said, you've been to places all over the African continent as well. So what inspired you to really stay longer, to stick around for many months or even years, for example, in the UK, rather than parachute in as so many of us are doing? And how does that sort of contribute to your identity as an academic, as a scholar?
Yeah, I think there are different strands to that. On the one hand, of course, the adventure of travel, meeting new people, having unexpected conversations, seeing new things. I think that all fits very well with the academic mindset, that sort of innate curiosity that academics should have. So yes, I think travel is a luxury, and we have to recognize that it's costly and it has a cost and impact on the environment. But I do think it is fundamental to the academic life, the life of the mind, to expose yourself to different contexts and new impressions. And again, realizing that your own experience is only one experience. So that's part of it, I think. Another part of it is that the South African academic context can be, as I've mentioned, be a bit parochial and exceptionalist sometimes. And we have to really, I think, get out of this context also to see how our experience and our knowledge relate to other contexts and do more comparative work. And the South African research community is also quite small, so it is necessary to engage more widely. So it's been a real privilege to have the opportunity to go to places like the UK and the US and Europe, but equally and maybe even more so to go to places like India and all over the African continent, and broaden one's experience also in terms of how other places in the global south and on the continent, how the South African experience relates or do not relate to those places that we share a sort of political history with. I think, if you travel on the continent, for instance, you can see how colonialism shaped the continent and impacted on the continent in sometimes similar but also diverse ways. And as a white South African, particularly, travels on the continent has always been very instructive for me, to say that, if you say that you belong on this continent. If you say that you're an African, a white African, I think you do have a responsibility, even a moral responsibility, to get to know the continent and to get to know the various regions of the continent and countries. But to maybe come back to your question as to why this is academically important, I think there's a real recognition in the last few years that globalization has been unequal, and it has been asymmetrical, and that it has largely been driven by the North. So my going to other places and in interacting with colleagues elsewhere, on the one hand, for me, I learn a lot, I benefit from it. But I do think I also want to bring some of this perspective of the global South to those spaces, to go to the ICA, for instance, and engage with its internationalization program, and to say, I can maybe contribute something to that understanding that the organization has to change, and bring some of my own experience there. So I think it's this dialectic between going to other places, benefiting from it, but also going elsewhere and bringing some of my own experience and perspectives to bear on those conversations.
That provides a nice bridge to today. We'd love to chat a bit more about your new book on the ethics of engagement. Like you're just talking about all your travels, and especially the travels across the African continent. That really comes back in this book, where you constantly refer back to specific issues, cases, conflicts throughout the African continent as examples of a broader argument you make about the ethics of listening as a sort of a necessary requirement for anybody, but people in the media and journalists in particular, to truly do justice to what's going on in people's lives, not to gloss over conflict or to solve conflict, but to sort of show it in all its different manifestations. And I mean, you've been talking about this ethics of listening for a while now. For over the last decade, in various publications, in your inaugural lecture back in 2012 and at Rhodes University, you made this a central focus of your argument, and you tie this ethics of listening, of truly being interested and amplifying the widest possible variety of voices in the community, to human dignity. And what I found really interesting is that when we talk about dignity, that it tends to have two dimensions, like a sort of an objective dimension of structures like human rights and legislation and formal protections for people as they go through life, but also I think you call it a substantive tradition, or a subjective tradition, where people need to feel seen and to be recognized and to taken seriously. And that's where your passion seems to be really lying, is to amplify that and to talk about that. And why do you feel? I mean, so sorry, it's a bit of a complicated question, but on the one hand, I would want to ask you, like, why do you feel that this aspect of dignity is so important? And in your book, it's like, it's like on every page almost. And secondly, it's relatively under discussed, or sometimes not even discussed at all, in our field, in media and journalism studies. I mean, there's a lot of work done on human dignity in the context of communication, but not so much in media studies, it seems. So it's a two-part question, both about your personal passion for the issue, and then the broader issue in our field. If you
Right.
if you dude could talk about that, for the next 3 hours or so.
Okay, all right, you can make a cup of tea while I answer the question. No, I think, yeah, so the maybe firstly the distinction between, say, more substantive and procedural ethics. So when you look at part of this transformation of the South African media post 94, one of the major advances was to design a self-regulatory system, codes of ethics, really as a bulwark against state interference, the rethinking of journalists of themselves as professionals. So that whole professionalization and media codes of ethics and self-regulatory system that came into being was a really important part of this transformation. But often that focus on a certain sort of procedural, professional type of ethics, codification, and often, it was based on frameworks that have been inherited from the North. So things like media freedom, libertarianism, individual rights, social responsibility theory, especially initially. And that system has been revised and developed further over the years, and it's become more of a co-regulatory system with more, I think, awareness of context, which is good. But I think the conversation in the country that needs to be had more often and more substantively is question of what exactly the media's role in a country such as ours should be, also within the context of the global South. So, and what are the characteristics? I mean, these characteristics are severe socioeconomic inequalities, a history of political polarization that is mapped onto race and ethnicity. And if you think about dignity, in a country such as ours, and also in a continent such as ours, people's dignity have been trampled upon for centuries. So it's been human dignity has been violated, not only in terms of physical terms of people being oppressed and harassed and killed, and all that horrible history that is really so foundational to our country and other places on the continent, but also epistemologically, also in terms of how the country and its people and the continent itself is framed and presented in global media discourses. So for me, that is and there's a long and even growing literature around Africa's media image as well, and people have done really good work on that. I think about people like Mel Bunce and Chris Patterson, and there's this school of work, I think, that is coming to the fore that is really important there. But I think I would go beyond just representation to the practices of journalism itself. In other words, how do you engage with people and listen to them in a way that's not just a facile sort of we are giving voice to the voiceless? I think journalists often claim that, but is it really true? Is it really your job to give somebody else's voice? They already have the voice. You just have to listen to it and listen to it more carefully. And then I think in a country such as ours, where we have this tremendous inequalities, where we often, it's different worlds, literally a few kilometers apart from where I'm sitting now. I live a very comfortable suburban life of privilege, and, a few kilometers from here, the most desperate poverty. So you think about the media in such a context, and you think, you cannot but think about dignity, and you cannot think about media's ethical role in a society such as this without asking yourself the question, but on whose behalf are you really talking? And if you talk about the public interest, which is such a foundational notion in media ethics, which public and whose interests? We have so many different publics in this country, and often they don't speak to each other. But the media often just speaks to a certain elite, especially the print media. And now, of course, the whole social media landscape has also developed in a way that I think amplifies, and this is not new. I mean, we know this from around the world, but amplifies these echo chambers. And if you map that onto the South African experience, or even the African experience with these inequalities, those inequalities become even more amplified in this digital environment. So I would say, I think listening for me is really an ethical imperative to move beyond the idea of ethics as based in individual rights or even objectivity and professionalism, to say that there has to be an active commitment to the restoration of dignity. And that's, of course, a controversial position. Many journalists will tell you, this is not our job. Our job is not to go out and work for transformation. Our work is to reflect society back to itself, or our job is to report, and you make you make up your own mind. But I think if we think about journalism as having the potential to contribute to transformation of society, we have to think about it as becoming more participatory, more dialogic, um, and that sort of listening is in other words a sort of socio-political, socio-economic imperatives. Now, there's also a type of listening I think that is increasingly being promoted as a type of a response to the deficit of trust in the media. So we've around the world we see there's a huge decline in trust. And so I think if we do listening properly, and there's a whole, I mean, I didn't invent this, there's, especially in Australia, people like Tanya Dreher has done really important work around listening. Some of my own insights on listening also come from people like Susan Bickford, as a political scientist in the US. So it's not like, I invented it. But I think there's a new way of thinking about engaging with audiences as a sort of PR and marketing strategy, to rebuild that trust from a sort of commercial imperative. And this is not what I'm arguing. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I think the sort of listening that I'm interested in has to do with acknowledging your own limitations, your own limited perspectives and knowledge as a journalist, or as an academic, as a critic, and then going out actively beyond your boundaries, beyond your borders, and trying to listen. And that sort of listening is dangerous. It's risky because you have to open yourself up to possibly revising your view of the world. It means that you have to let go of the control of the story and enable that story to be rewritten from other perspectives. So it's risky, it's dangerous, and it requires a real commitment. But I'm idealistic. What can I say?
While you were talking, I was reminded of in another episode of this interview series. I talked with Henry Jenkins about his career and his work, and it's interesting that you mentioned that this notion of participatory culture, of active listening, of involving your audiences or community or whatever, who are the people you're trying to reach as a media professional, to involve them as co-creators of what you're doing or what you're thinking about. In your book, you talk about citizens as co-creators of norms, right? But then you say, like, well, you can do that from a more commercial perspective, which is fine, but that's, you want to make it a more foundational. But that's kind of where Henry's work is. His work on convergence culture is very much calling on the media industry to take their audiences seriously, and that is generally framed within a commercial context. And when I talked with him about this, that concern came very much out of his own personal life as a fan, as somebody who's just excited about Star Trek, or about just about anything that in the media, about TV shows, and wanting to be taken seriously and to talk with people about it. And then once he got into a position of relative power, as you are when an academic, and you travel the world and you get to speak your mind, to really promote that and to bring people along for the ride. And so I was just thinking about that, to what extent this, if we go back to the start of our conversation, your experiences as a working journalist, as being part of this transformative phase in South African history, has really shaped the development of this ethics of listening, this ethics of engagement, that your new book, because your new book really feels to me as almost like you looking back over your work. It has that sort of general kind of vibe, for lack of a better term, to it. Do you see that link as well? And is this book a way for you to take responsibility for that experience? If I may ask that question, maybe it's a bit too direct, but.
Well, maybe I'm just repeating myself, and it's not so much looking back as regurgitating. But I think, I think the listening aspect for me does come out of my own experience, both as a journalist, which is now really, quite a few years, behind me, but also as a media user and consumer in this country, in this context. And I think I think the media are stuck in this a very difficult space at the moment. And, I think we might get to that, but if we critique the media, we also have to acknowledge that it is not easy being a journalist these days, and especially on this continent, and maybe I should say something about media freedom as well, because um, although I critique the media often and propose new frameworks, I mean, at the same time, I recognize that in many places in this continent and in this country, it's dangerous to be a journalist, and there's lots of threats, and media freedom is under attack. But we can maybe get to that later. But I think so the listening aspect, I think, does come from the experience of the media in this country as having that very difficult job of reporting on what's going on, but often reporting for a very small market, a very specific market that can access and buy newspapers, or that advertisers are interested in. So it's the old political economy arguments, but maybe writ large in a context like ours that is really socioeconomically so exceptionally unequal. So you have the phenomenon of journalists reporting on a wider society, but doing so for a specific niche audience. So the example that I use in the book, is from on activism and protest. So I've done some work with Katrien Boltmer and others in a project called MECODEM, Media, Conflict and Democracy, and which is really sort of the starting point of this book. I don't draw on the data so much, but that was the inspiration. And we tracked media reporting of protests in this country, and if I say protests, you have to realize that there's an average of it differs, but 1.5 protests per day in this country for more than a decade now. So we really have this sort of protest culture. And so what you often hear on the radio in, driving to work is people are saying, avoid that road, the N1 leading to town, because there's a barricade and people are protesting. Rather take this road to town if you want to get to work. So what does that tell us? It tells us that a lot of people are unhappy or frustrated, and they find the only way to get the ear and get politicians listening to them is by burning tires and blocking a road. But you have the media, so maybe tired or exhausted about this, but also not interested anymore. They don't tell you what the protest is about. They just tell you avoid this road, because they are speaking to people who are professionals, middle-class people wanting to get to work. So on the one hand, they're reporting on the reality, but they're reporting it from a very specific perspective. And Stephen Friedman, political scientist, South African political scientist, spoke about this as the view from the suburbs. The view of the world is one that is from a vantage point of the suburbs. So listening, I think, for me, comes out of that experience of seeing the media having to try and meet this challenge of reporting conflict and doing so for a broader public.
Now, obviously, I mean, we can be very critical about, and some of the reflection that you just shared is like, it's quite critical of the role that journalists play or can play in these types of conflicts, right? I mean, often perhaps even unwittingly siding with the existing social order, with privileged middle classes that are also the intended audiences for their advertisers and their sponsors, and those kind of arguments. And however, I mean, when I read your work, both the new book and all your previous work, you're always so hopeful. Like there's this I mean, Richard Rorty called that the philosophy of social hope, and he always made the argument, like, if you're not hopeful, then why do research in the first place? But you really make this explicit time and time again. And you have a book or a paper out on something that went horribly wrong, like a clear instance of media failure, if you will. You have this sort of hopeful perspective. Well, if we just go the extra mile, do this extra thing, engage in this listening across difference, this concept, this beautiful concept that you often use, that our mutual friend Tanya Dreyer coined a long time ago. There is this notion that we can be better, right? Things can be better, despite all the stuff that you've just documented. And I really appreciate that, and I think it's really inspiring. And what I would like to ask you is how can we if we assume for a moment that things can be better, people can do better, and in this case, particularly journalists, what can we do to help and protect journalists, and not just their safety, but also their mental health and well-being? I must admit, this is a bit of a topic that I've become increasingly concerned about. That we expect so much from journalists, and in general, and of course in times of conflict and trauma even more so. And at the same time, we know how precarious the work of journalists is, and has become through all kinds of economic circumstances. And then on top of that, as you said earlier, the decline of trust that people have in the work of journalists. I mean, what can we do for journalists? And what is our responsibility as academics that in part also train and educate journalists?
Yeah, thanks. I think, yeah, thank you first in the first instance for that generous reading of my work. You could also have said I'm naive, but I think, yeah, I think
we
it
have
is
to be.
important. I think it is important to remain hopeful. And again, if you look at the way that African societies often responded to crises, I remember when it was in 2008 when the global economic crisis hit, and I was sitting in IMCR meeting, I think it was in Dublin, and Francis Nyamjo gave a keynote speech, and the whole theme of this conference was, how do we deal with this economic crisis? And Francis just said, as Africans, we've been in crisis perpetually. So it's not something new. And it's now economic crisis because it has hit the Europe and North America, but we've been living through the IMF and structural adjustments and colonization, all of that. So the point being, I think, is that if you look at again at the African experience, often people have to choose between either laughing or crying, and so people tend to laugh and remain hopeful and humorous, and that's why humor is such a really important thread in communication and media in the continent as well. You can only see when the pandemic hit in South Africa, for instance, the first response was for people to make jokes about it, which might sound insensitive, but that is the sort of response that has often saved people, is to try and laugh about things. So yeah, I think humor and hope are never far from each other, and I think also live in the city that's called the Cape of Good Hope. People have seen this place as good hope. But more seriously, I think when we critique, we have to do that from a basis in reality and a basis in acknowledging context. So it is, otherwise it does become a sort of armchair critique. So I think if you want to be critical and you want to be critical of journalists' ethical transgressions, for instance, or offer suggestions for improvement, you have to also acknowledge that they are working under huge pressures. That the media work is becoming increasingly precarious, and you've written about this extensively, economic conditions, but also in the African context, often very real threats, harassment, imprisonment, people being trolled, especially women journalists being attacked online. And so many journalists in Africa and other places in the global South are really risking their lives to practice journalism. So I think if you assume that position of critic and offering critique, you also have to try and understand, how can this criticism land? How can this criticism land in the real context? So I've always tried to balance my criticism with some sort of support. I'm involved with organizations such as Reporters Without Borders. I've done work with UNESCO, with the World Health Organization this year around the pandemic. Media training and so on. And that I really think is a way to remain engaged, but it's also a way of doing good journalism, because it gives you insight into the context in which you work. So yes, I think being hopeful and trying to see ways in which we could make the world a better place. And otherwise, why do it? I mean, otherwise, if you don't think that your work is going to contribute to improve society in some way. And I must say that sometimes it's a difficult position, because journalists do not always appreciate it. And there is sometimes the idea from journalists that you sit in an ivory tower and you just launch missiles, and they are the ones that are having to pick up the pieces. And I think to some extent maybe that is true, and one understands that. But I think that's why it is important to also try and get involved with journalists or journalist organizations and try to support it in some way. But yeah, I think critique has to be based in context and not disembodied from the work.
It's. I mean, we could go on for hours about this, but I don't want to take too much of your time either. But it is interesting that, I mean, I do think that all of our work in media studies and journalism studies is inherently hopeful, but most of us don't make that explicit. But right, we critique something because we hope that it could be better. Right? But we never actually talk about the could be better part of things. But you do that, and you've consistently done that, and that's something. I think it's really powerful. And maybe in conclusion, one way you operationalize this hopeful perspective, especially in the new book, is to point at the productive potential of conflict. Right? To say, like, one way of doing this is to not gloss over conflict, not to talk or do research on conflict or things in the context of conflict in a way to make it go away, or to diminish it or to limit it, but to accept it as, this is an inseparable from, this is what human life in part is all about. I mean, it is about conflict, and some of the conflict is huge and traumatizing, like war or terrorism, and some of it is much more mundane, like everyday, arguments or conflicts that you can have at home or in the neighborhood. But conflict is there, and conflict can be made, and according to your argument, incredibly productive. And to me, that's like an operationalization of this hopeful perspective. It's like, how can we use conflict? Maybe in conclusion to our conversation, can you talk a little bit more about that specific aspect of how you use conflict in this book and in your work in general?
Yeah, so I think my interest in conflict is because in the South African context, but also many African societies, there's a long history of very violent and very destructive conflict. So I certainly don't want to romanticize this at all. I think one has to recognize that conflict takes absolutely destructive forms and can be devastating. I think the importance here is to think, and my book is also framed in terms of democratization conflicts, so conflicts that arise out of the democratization process. So it's not a conflicts that have to do with the violent suppression, for instance, of democracy, or the violent suppression of freedom of speech, but it is the sort of conflicts that emerge when that process has started to evolve, and often after formal democratization. So if you think of the South African example, again, formally, we became a democracy in 1994. But today, still, we have the sort of conflicts that erupt in protests, as I've described, or have and increasingly also online conflict. And so the challenge is for us to think about these democratization conflicts in a way that make them and render them productive. And think about the media's role in terms of how to render them productive. So the media can often, I think, contribute to these tensions if they just pit one side against the other and report on it as if it were a boxing match. And instead of looking for solutions or facilitating productive debates, and I think we're then in that terrain. Increasingly, people are talking about solutions journalism, constructive journalism, and those terms are often contested as well. But I think there is a recognition that instead of just doing this sort of stenography of conflict, there can be a way of de-escalating conflict. So, and if you look at the work of Chantal Mouffe, the distinguishes between agonism and antagonism. And I think the antagonism that we often see is that attempt to destroy or vanquish your opponent. That you want to emerge as the victor at any cost. But what you do is you destroy that symbolic terrain upon which that conflict is taking place. Whereas Agonism is more of a creative tension, and you try and preserve that that symbolic space because people are invested in it, and then you know, if you say, well, let's try and generate new possibilities out of this conflict. I've actually, you know, really interesting. I've trained as a conflict mediator at some point as well, because I think that sort of mediation process that we see in conflict mediation, there's some lessons to learn for media as well. And again, you know, a lot of journalists will say, well, this is not our job. Our job is not to facilitate conflict, you know, and try to, we're just reporting. And I think that's a bit of a cop-out. You know, I think, again, to come back to listening, if you listen carefully to those that disagree from you, and people that come from different experiences, different backgrounds, even if you continue to disagree with them, you can engage with them in a way that can help de-escalate conflict and harness it to deepen democratic participation. So I think that is the challenge, is to not to say that by listening I condone what you're doing or what you're saying. I can disagree with that vehemently. But I think to say that I, again, take your dignity, I assume that you have an inherent dignity as a human being, and therefore I need to engage with you in a way. And it's sometimes very difficult, because, you know, one of the areas that have become more active in now is the disinformation studies. And right. So when you think about these echo chambers and where people retreat to those echo chambers in Twitter and fire off these missiles, just trying to destroy the other party, you know, it becomes, it is, we know that Twitter, for instance, is often a horrible place to be for that specific reason. But if you want to engage with disinformation, I think increasingly we recognize that you have to try and first understand why people are spreading disinformation, especially, for instance, around the pandemic. And you think about, why is this person spreading anti-vaccination conspiracy theories? Maybe they're afraid, or they're anxious, or they don't have the correct information. And you have to resist that position. You have to say, that's what you're doing is wrong, but let me try and find out why you think that way, and listen to, and then you can engage with it more productively. But when you just seek to destroy the other party, you know, I think that then conflict becomes destructive and it becomes violent, either literally or figuratively. But you know, then you don't make any progress to some sort of solution. So yeah, I think there's a place for sometimes for no platforming. I mean, that's a big debate, and sometimes views are so abhorrent, I think, that they don't deserve to be heard. But I think we need to engage in critical, robust debates without kidding each other, and I think that is what this country has taught us as well.
Yeah. Thanks so much. I mean, talk about conflict. What many people perhaps don't know, but I know, because we know each other very well, is that you're an expert at what the South African grill, the braai. But I also know that you're about to go on a sabbatical to Texas. Now, Texas has its own very proud barbecue kind of culture. So, I mean, that's going to create some interesting conflict. I mean, because if South Africans are proud of anything, it's their braai cultures. And I experienced both. It could be quite a contested space, I think. I don't know how you're going to resolve that one.
Yeah, I think I'll go there to listen first, and try and sample all the wares. You know.
Yeah. Just try to stay away from, or not stay away, but just to get over the fact that everything is just smothered in sauces, and you go like, no. But with all due respect to the beautiful tradition of the American barbecue, of course. Herman, thanks so much for your time and for your work, and for this lovely conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark, for the invitation, and I really enjoy speaking to you, and I hope we'll get to debate these things again in person somewhere over a braai or a barbecue, or fish and chips in the UK, or broodje haring in Amsterdam. But
all right,
we'll get together again, hopefully.
Absolutely.